Good afternoon, everybody. Hello and welcome. I'm Kimberly Cowell-Myers. I'm faculty in the government department, and I have the wonderful duty this afternoon to say nice things about people and to express gratitude. Just to kick off, I would like to recognize the sponsors of the event, including the School of Public Affairs here at American University, the Women in Politics Institute in the School of Public Affairs. Sorry, the list is long, so bear with me. We have so much interest. Georgetown University's Global Irish Studies Initiative, the School of International Service here at American University, the Peace, Human Rights, and Cultural Relations Department in the School of International Service, the European Law Association and the Washington College of Law at American University, and the Transatlantic Policy Center here in SIS at American University as well. So 7 co-sponsors, that's how appealing a talk from Emma is. So as a leader in peace building, civil society, gender and politics, and youth participation, Emma DeSouza has much to offer the world. I've read her work and watched her in awe from a distance for a long time. I had the opportunity to meet her in person this past March after she spoke at an event marking the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, in which she shared a stage with the Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar and the former US Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton, alongside a number of other female political leaders who dedicated their lives to public service and transformational change. Emma pointed out then, as she has often this year, the anniversary constitutes an occasion to recognize the profound change the peace process has brought to Northern Ireland, while at the same time acknowledging the disappointments, the inequities, the injustices, and the continued sources of conflict. Emma's often argued these constitute opportunities for youth to enact change from the ground up, saying my generation needs to stand up and say we want to see delivery. I give you Emma DeSouza.
Thank you, Kimberly, and it is a pleasure to be with you here today. Thank you for coming along. As Kimberly was just saying, this year marks the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And with this big milestone, there were a lot of galas, conferences, dinners, concerts, and a lot of the focus was on politics. Now, there is, of course, no question of the significance of political negotiation. Subsequent referenda in Ireland, North and South, gave us 72% of support in Northern Ireland and 94% in the Republic of Ireland. These results were down to several factors: political leadership, desperation for an end to violence, a lot of fatigue about negotiation, and for many, an unadulterated desire for peace. However, the journey to peace did not happen overnight. And it entailed decades of hard work in and across communities by activists and civic society leaders. It took more than politics to deliver the peace process. It required people. And today I'm going to be speaking with you about the role of women, youth, and community-led movements in effecting societal change in Northern Ireland. And I'm going to do that in 3 parts, so a past, present, future, if you will. Civic society played a key role throughout the conflict, with several groups and initiatives emerging to strengthen cross-community support and make the case for peaceful resolution. In 1976, it was Peace People, founded by Mairead Maguire and Betty Williams. They organized huge rallies, thousands of people on the street, rallying and protesting for an end to violence. Both women then went on to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. In the 1980s, it was civic society that created the first integrated education programs and integrated schools. In 1992, a group of civic activists actioned the OPSAL Commission, a citizens' inquiry which engaged with groups to find pathways forward. The OPSAL report contains several recommendations, which, to not my surprise, ended up going into the Good Friday Agreement itself. That was things like a Bill of Rights, parity of esteem. Beyond these few short examples, including the fact that the yes referendum itself was run by Quentin Oliver, who at the time was the director of NICFA, which is a large civic society organization in Northern Ireland. He actually resigned from his post to campaign for the yes referendum. But beyond these examples, there are so many unrecognized, unseen work that is done by people in their communities to be able to provide fertile soil for peace. And of course, women were at the forefront. One of the most notable civic society mobilizations was the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, founded in 1996 and ultimately disbanded in 2006. The Women's Coalition saw women's groups from across the divide uniting on a platform of bringing women's concerns to the negotiating table and ensuring an inclusive peace accord. Coalition members hosted regular consultations with civic society organizations to inform their negotiating positions and quickly gained a reputation as honest brokers and trusted intermediaries by prioritizing cooperation over partisan allegiances. The Women's Coalition set a precedent with its inclusive process of cross-community dialogue and civil engagement, inspiring not just a new generation of peace builders, but inspiring the creation of UN Security Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. Professor Desiree Nelson of Uppsala University in Sweden has demonstrated that peace agreements are 64% less likely to fail when civil society representatives participate. There too is empirical data to support the importance of women in making and sustaining peace. An International Peace Institute study of 182 peace agreements signed between 1989 and 2011 found that when women are included in peace processes, there is a 35% increase in the probability that a peace agreement will last 15 years or more. Evidence suggests that female participants in peace processes are more likely to be focused on reconciliation, economic development, and transitional justice, all critical elements of a sustained peace. Peace is more than just the absence of conflict. And it is upon that principle where the Women's Coalition's mark can really be seen. Members brought to the table education, mixed housing, the reintegration of political prisoners, specific language on victims' rights, and the formation of the Civic Forum, all of which play a significant role in promoting social cohesion and embedding lasting peace. Without the Women's Coalition and the various community-based movements for peace in Northern Ireland, I don't think we would be here celebrating 25 years. Since 1998, more than 600 people have been born in Northern Ireland. Growing up under a sustained period of peace, where identity and culture no longer have the same connotations as their parents and grandparents. Research from the Northern Ireland Youth Forum has found a generation focused on mental health, climate, human rights, and a wide range of social and economic issues such as housing and education. The findings also show that young people in Northern Ireland have a keen interest in politics, but feel they cannot influence decision-making. What this points to is a generation both politically engaged, yet politically disenfranchised. Many of these young people have grown up without a functioning government, as Northern Ireland's power sharing institutions have only been up for 2 of the last 7 years. Since 1998, Northern Ireland's power sharing institutions have only functioned 60% of the time, and we currently do not have a functioning government. Rather than engage at a political level, we see a generation opting for other forms of political participation, which follows other global trends. Many of today's young people have suffered the consequences of the 2008 financial crisis. I'm sure there are a few people in this room that have felt that too. And those who follow will face similar challenges on the back of the economic impact of COVID-19 and Russia's war in Ukraine. Recession, stagnant or falling living standards and austerity have shaped the life experiences of so many young people. And this global embodiment of unfulfilled youthful aspiration is propagating a resurgence of predominantly youth-led resistance. This resurgence of protests has highlighted a growing rift between the values of older and younger generations. The movement which dismantled the Sudanese government, for example, was largely divided down generational lines. Similarly, in the UK, young people came out in their thousands to protest against Brexit in a youth-led collective aptly called Our Future, Our Choice. The Brexit referendum was split between younger and older voters, seeing 71% of citizens under the age of 25 vote to remain, while 65% of those over 65 voted to leave the European Union. Historically, meaningful change has often been sparked outside of government buildings by independent campaigners, activists, civic society organizations, who then place a duty on the government to enact legislative changes. And there's evidence that this form of political participation works. In Northern Ireland, legislative changes don't happen often, but when they do, they can often be traced to a community-based movement, such as the campaigns for safe access zones, free period products, climate action, mental health, and same-sex marriage. In the Republic of Ireland, many of the progressive steps to lift the shroud of conservatism over the past decade have come from civic society and particularly from young people. The Yes for Equality and Repeal the Eighth campaigns brought an undeniable energy and urgency to the steps of Leinster House. And the Home to Vote movement enfranchised an entire generation of Irish citizens to remain politically engaged. It's hard to imagine these campaigns and the progress they inspired being achieved if the issue had been left entirely in the hands of politicians. And if I may speak a little to my own background. As an independent campaigner, I have benefited from being outside the political system, and certainly from being outside party politics. I didn't come from a political background, I wasn't an activist, but I quickly learned the ropes when, several years ago now, I encountered a challenge to my right to be accepted as Irish under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. Now, back then, I couldn't have told you much about constitutional law or European law or how these interacted in terms of a dual legislative system, but I had to figure that out. And over the course of 5 years, I campaigned to get legislative changes to bring UK immigration law in line with the Good Friday Agreement. During that time, I faced sectarian harassment, threats to my safety, and a very constant message that I should just make things easier for myself. Why am I putting myself through all this trouble for this issue? But that is what the system tries to do. It tries to tell you that you can't win. And it makes it hard. It's onerous, it's bureaucratic. You're almost always going to be outmatched by resources and by experience. But after 5 years, after knocking down a lot of doors and asking for a lot of help, getting political support, getting the support of the media, eventually our case changed UK immigration law, bringing it in line with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And families across Northern Ireland were able to benefit from those changes. And now that I've had 3 years to reflect on that period of my life, where I suddenly found myself becoming an activist, I like to think that our case serves as an example, that one person can make a difference, that each and every one of us has a role to play in affecting change, that you have more power than you realize, and you can use it. This year, civic society's vital role in delivering and sustaining peace has frankly been reduced It's a little more than a footnote in many of the anniversaries around the Good Friday Agreement. This isn't an altogether surprising thing, given that in the years immediately following the Good Friday Agreement, the community and voluntary sector was systemically underfunded and unappreciated. A lack of investment means we have an aging society of peace builders who have dedicated much, if not most, of their life to supporting and sustaining peace. Many of these peace builders were put on notice recently, following a failure of the UK government to replace the European Social Fund, a further casualty of Brexit. And during the Good Friday Agreement anniversary celebrations in Belfast, where we had a significant conference with global leaders descending upon Northern Ireland to celebrate 25 years of peace, and where people were speaking about the role of women, we had women's organizations losing 50% of their staff because of a lack of funding. Despite this lack of funding, positive work is happening. There's one thing we know how to do, it's to deliver work on a shoestring. And right across Northern Ireland, led by people in their communities, there is positive work happening. They might not make the headlines. Certainly they don't make the headlines because we love a negative news story in Northern Ireland, so you're not going to see the good stuff. But their impact is being felt in some of the most deprived areas. And I have up here on this slide just some examples of positive work being done in Northern Ireland today. One of the greatest challenges we face is the complete dysfunction of our political system. And rather than viewing the role of civic society as an essential component in a functioning democracy, it is perceived by some in politics as a threat. The combative nature of our political system stifles civic voice, with community workers and civic leaders regularly being subjected to sectarian harassment and threats to their safety for having views on socioeconomic challenges, even 25 years on from the Good Friday Agreement. We have in Northern Ireland some of the highest levels of violence against women. 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement, femicide levels in Northern Ireland are only outranked by Romania. Research from the Ulster University last week showed that 98% of respondents have encountered at least one form of violence or abuse as a woman in Northern Ireland. And because of our political system, which entrenches sectarian identity politics, issues like gender equality, poverty, the issues that are really impacting people's lives, they get thrown to the wayside. It took until 2021, 23 years after the Good Friday Agreement, before we could even get our politicians to agree that it might be a good idea to have a strategy to deal with violence against women. And we still don't have it because we don't have a political system operating at the moment. There is a clear and pressing need to depoliticize the role of civic society and for political leaders to recognize the immense value and importance of civic voice to representative democracy. Recognizing the growing disillusionment stemming from Northern Ireland's political vacuum, civic society is once again stepping up, as we so often have to do. A lack of new ideas has never been the problem. It's having the framework and the means to be able to harness those ideas. And so what civic society organizations are currently doing is we've created a new participatory deliberative space structure called Civic Initiative. This space is designed to, in a way, fill the void from the civic forum, creating a space for citizens to engage on the issues that impact their lives and to try and find pathways and solutions, because as history shows us, the answers are not in the hands of politicians. The answers are in the hands of people. The agreement is lauded as one of the most successful peace deals of the past century, and it is seen as a global model. But the vast majority of its mechanisms and commitments to build social cohesion, improve equality, and deliver an economic peace dividend has never been realized. I spoke earlier about the various commitments the Women's Coalition got into the Good Friday Agreement. Yet it's these vital provisions, things like integrated education, a civic forum, shared housing schemes, they have been the ones that women got on the table and that have been allowed to languish. Education remains 93% segregated. Mixed housing schemes continue to underdeliver, and the Civic Forum was unofficially disbanded after just 2 years in operation. The peace process, frankly, is stagnant. And there is a strong need for fresh thinking, new ideas, and I'm here to tell you today that those ideas are on the ground, and that's where they're coming from. And I'm going to open the floor now to any questions.
Caroline Croft, Civil International Service. Why do you think there's so much domestic violence in Northern Ireland against women?
And would you repeat the question just for the live stream?
Yep. Thank you, Caroline. So the question is, why do I think there is so much domestic violence in Northern Ireland? And there's been quite a bit of research done on this. I think that if you look at what we see in conflict zones and in post-conflict zones, is that there tends to be a spike in gender-based violence, both during times of conflict and in a post-conflict environment, which is why it's so important to get gender equality and issues around gender violence into peace agreements. Now, it is notable that in the Good Friday Agreement, women are mentioned twice. The word woman is there twice, but it's no reference to violence against women or tackling the issues in terms of women's experience of conflict. So there is a gap there that I think what we're looking at is the legacy of the conflict. There might not necessarily be violence on the streets, but violence hasn't gone away. It's just not as visible. And a lot of that comes from the history of the conflict, and mental health and poverty is a driving factor in a lot of this as well. And what we have is a system that's not tackling those issues. Then there's the perpetuated stereotypes around women and how women are seen in the media and how they're seen in public spaces. So it's a whole smorgasbord of problems. It requires things like trying to get the strategy for violence against women through legislation. But it's also worth noting that when I mentioned earlier the Women's Coalition inspiring 1325 has never been implemented in Northern Ireland. So we have 170 countries that have implemented 1325, and Northern Ireland, where the inspiration came from, we don't have it. So there's a big issue around trying to get the women, peace and security agenda on the agenda in Northern Ireland.
Just on that thing. So are there places, if you are a victim, are there places that you can call? Are there houses that you can go to? Is there training that exists for schools, judges, prosecutors? I mean, all of those things could exist without laws, right? That you could fund even without laws.
Yeah, so the question is around, is there services and spaces that are trying to tackle some of the challenges around gender violence? The answer is yes, but you'll not be surprised after my presentation to know that they are systemically underfunded. Women's Aid Northern Ireland would be the leading organisation providing services and essential services for women, especially those trying to leave domestic violence situations, and they have had most of their core funding just this year.
Can I just ask you, does the EU fund this at all?
Does the EU fund? Yeah, there is some European funding, but a lot of that's been cut because of Brexit. A lot of the funding coming through the European Social Fund was essential for these services. There was supposed to be agreement with the UK government that they would replicate that funding like for like, and it became 50% of that. So as a result, lots of women's organizations have really had their funding cut.
So our ambassador to London make a big deal.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Back there first.
Hi, a question from the law school. My primary interest is in housing law, and I know that in America, we struggle with integrated low-income housing because of zoning laws, which have been implemented since like racial segregation was officially allowed in the Jim Crow South. and that these zoning laws are the mechanism through which those housing initiatives are combated or fought against here in America. Could you speak a little bit about what are these mixed housing initiatives in Northern Ireland and what obstacles stand in the way to achieving these integrated mixed housing schemes?
Thank you for the question. So the question is around the mixed housing schemes in Northern Ireland and what some of the barriers are. The barriers to everything in Northern Ireland is politics. So the issue we have around mixed housing schemes is that there will be a plan drawn up on how to integrate a particular area. And then there will be opposition from usually a party like the DUP or representatives that do not think that this area should be integrated. And again, gets blocked up with bureaucracy and just never gets delivered. So, I mean, that's why today, it's also worth pointing out that today we have more peace walls in Northern Ireland than we had in 1998. Because there is this opposition to integrating in the way that we really need to. And there's also worth noting the risk of paramilitary violence in Northern Ireland. So they control a lot of these areas, especially those that were deprived during the conflict. And we see actually quite a lot of instances where families are being put out of their homes by paramilitaries. It's a couple of thousand over the last few years. It's underreported, but it's quite a serious issue that isn't being addressed and needs to be addressed through tackling things around justice. The fact that we have illegal paramilitary organizations that still operate in Northern Ireland 25 years later, that we actually have these ads on TV that are akin to like safe driving ads about how they're not our friends. It normalizes it to a degree that we shouldn't have to tolerate 25 years later. And they do have a big impact in terms of how we integrate our housing. Go ahead.
Thanks, Emma. Elizabeth Worden from School of Education here at American University. I was wondering if you could share some examples of youth activist groups that you're excited about, right? So you talked about how youth are engaged, yet disenfranchised from the legal system. So do you have any examples that come to mind of, civil society groups led by youth, maybe in Derry or Belfast, that you're excited about that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, youth groups that I'm excited about. I mean, some of the young people coming up in Northern Ireland today, I mean, if I look at Pure Mental NI, which is a youth-led mental health charity, I mean, that was established by two young people who were like 15. And like when I was that age, telling you, I would not have been doing this kind of work. And we really have a generation that is coming up that is really proactive, really engaged, and really wants to see change. So Pure Mental NI, I think, is a really inspiring example. There's also a wonderful campaign by Laura Bond, who is a youth MP for North Antrim. She's doing a campaign around Teach the Troubles. Now, that campaign is about trying to make Troubles history mandatory in the education system, because you would expect that people in Northern Ireland would be learning about the Troubles and the Good Friday Agreement in school. But no, actually, it's not part of our curriculum. It is not mandatory. Only those who take history, GCSE, which you opt to take at 15. So by that point, you've already developed a lot of ideas about society and people. Those who take history have the option of potentially being taught about the Troubles. Everyone else doesn't learn about it or the Good Friday Agreement. And Lauren and other young people in the Secondary Students' Union of Northern Ireland are campaigning really hard to make it mandatory, because it still impacts our lives. And if we expect the next generation to take forward the peace process and deliver on this work, I think we kind of have to teach them about it. So that's just some that I think are really quite inspiring. And we have lots of really great climate groups as well that are just doing incredible work. Thank you. Over here. One, I'll take both of these. So I'll take yourself and then yourself.
Thanks for being here today. So from the School of International Service, what campaigns are underway to pressure politicians to get back to work?
I'll take the second one as well.
I'm Siobhan from School of International Service. We've seen nationalistic ideologies on the rise globally. I'm wondering how this has been affected in Northern Ireland and what community groups are doing to combat it.
So it's nationalism? Yeah. Okay, these are very complementary two questions, so I'm going to put these together. This is great. So if I start with campaigns to get politicians back to work, it's a funny thing in Northern Ireland because we appear to tolerate not having politicians doing their job really quite a lot. We don't have significant groups pushing to get politicians back into Stormont. And I often wonder why that is. I think that if you look at the history of the conflict in Northern Ireland and why the electorate is perhaps so apathetic around having politicians sitting in Stormont, I think there's a couple of reasons behind it. One is it's quite clear that we don't need them because they haven't been in there for so long, and guess what? Stuff still functions, so they don't really do anything when we're actually in Stormont. And I think the other side to it is there's this idea that what we have is good enough. Because for a lot of people in Northern Ireland who grew up during the conflict, I think they're just happy to have an end to the violence. And that, well, anything is better than that. I think that's a challenge that we face in terms of the next generation, in terms of saying that, okay, well, it's great that we don't have violence anymore, but we are allowed to ask for more. We're allowed to ask for functioning government. And there's a challenge there in trying to get wider society to get behind that. On the question around nationalism, obviously nationalism, English nationalism is what led to Brexit. It's a really big problem globally at the moment. And in the Northern Irish context, I mean, ethno-national politics is ingrained into our political system. It's why we currently don't have a political system that's operating, because we have a mandatory power sharing structure that, whilst appropriate in 1998, isn't appropriate today, because we have now a different society that doesn't necessarily align themselves with unionism or nationalism. And what we need then is a political structure that reflects that, versus the fact that our politicians still have to designate as unionist or nationalist when they go in. So in terms of how nationalist politics has further sort of polarized Northern Irish politics, I would say that the instability we've seen since the Brexit vote is a pretty good indicator of how dangerous that ideology can be. Certainly, there's been a polarization of our political system, and it's very hard to see how that's going to get resolved. Identity politics, whilst it's softened for a few years after the Good Friday Agreement, has really sharpened since the Brexit referendum. And as you can see from the fact that we can't get our political institutions back up and running, it is having a serious impact. Anybody else? Okay, we do this row. 1, 2, go.
Hi, Emma. Post-Brexit, the talk of a united Ireland has bubbled up again. And I've seen in some of your writing, you kind of called out or taken to task some of the nationalist organizations and parties, both north and south of the border, on their unwillingness to produce a framework to reach, or at least address, the issue of a united Ireland. And I was just wondering, is there an Emma DeSouza broad framework for that?
Okay, I'll take that. I'll take this one here as well.
My question was on the impact of poverty on violence and how Brexit, although I believe less so compared to other countries in the UK, has impacted economic growth in Northern Ireland, and if because of that we've seen a spike in violence or in growth in paramilitary groups.
Okay, dokie, good questions. All right, I'll start with United Ireland, it's an easier one. I did write a paper on what United Ireland should look like, actually, which appears to be more than some of the political parties have actually done. I think the challenge we face is that Brexit has fundamentally shifted the conversation around United Ireland. I mean, it is part of mainstream media now. It's on primetime debates on the radio. If you were to look at the media over the last couple of weeks, there's been this tic-tacking between the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and the Taoiseach around being able to aspire for United Ireland. There's just no way that you can say that Brexit didn't 100% increase the timeline on a referendum, because it's changed what a United Ireland means to people. For many people now, a United Ireland is not some sort of romantic nationalist dream, but it's actually about returning to the European Union. And there are a lot more than just nationalists that want to be European. So that's the big contributing factor. And what concerns me is the lack of preparation. Because if we look at Brexit, we have a pretty good idea of how not to run a referendum.
Yeah.
You know, it's like it's like being stuck in Groundhog Day for the last 7 years. And, you know, Labour has now said that they're going to try and renegotiate if they get into power. And all I can think is, sweet God, are we going to keep doing this? Because it is never ending. And if you look at the Good Friday Agreement, what you have is an example of how to run a referendum. People were given a copy of what they were voting for. They were given a document that outlined what their vote meant. It was sent to every household and people were able to make an informed decision. That's where you have a 72% and 94% result, whereas Brexit is so divisive at 52-48. So we know that if we want to prepare for United Ireland, people have to know what they're voting for, unless we want to have our own version of Brexit. And it is a point of frustration that political parties who aspire for United Ireland, whose entire slogan might be the United Ireland Party, but they don't actually have a vision, a plan, or any detail on what that's going to look like. And I personally think that's reckless, because you can't control the timeline of this kind of referendum. If you look at examples like Germany, this kind of change can come very fast. And also we can't control when a referendum is called, because the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland has full power for when that vote was called. What if it was called with only a 6 months notice? You would never be able to figure out what would an all-Ireland education system look like, what would an all-Ireland healthcare system look like, what's going to happen to people's pensions, what's going to happen to the civil service, what's going to happen to policing in the course of 6 months. It would take several years. So I think that that is a big challenge we have, getting political parties to do this work. But as I said in this presentation, it's often civic society that does this stuff. And we do have grassroots community-based groups that are doing a lot of the work. There's groups like Ireland's Future, and there's also groups that are already going to be the pro-UK groups as well. You have Uniting UK, Together UK. I mean, the political leaders might not be doing the work, but we already have yes and no referendums on the ground. They're already there. So, but if you want to read my framework, it's on my website. Just to finish this question here. Okay, so the impact of poverty on violence and the economic impact of Brexit, paramilitary, that's all a very good question. So it's all connected in terms of the impact. And really, I see poverty as a form of state violence. What we have in Northern Ireland is some of the areas that were most impacted by the conflict are the areas that are still steeped in economic deprivation. These are the areas that haven't felt the peace dividend. We don't have an anti-poverty strategy. And the Good Friday Agreement included mechanisms and commitments to address regional disparity, economic inequality, equality of opportunity, like so much of the actual meat of that agreement that hasn't been delivered. And that has an impact 100% in terms of on poverty levels, poverty and violence levels. They're interconnected. And often women who are in an environment where they're steeped within poverty can't leave a domestic violence situation. So it is a significant contributing factor. Economic impact of Brexit, yeah, we have been a bit softened because of the Northern Ireland Protocol / Windsor Framework. It has given us an opportunity, the dual market access. I mean, Scotland would take your arm off to get that deal. Of course, we're stuck trying to argue over it. So we haven't necessarily felt some of those negative impacts. There were some examples, actually, there was a shortage of chicken at Nando's across the UK, but in Northern Ireland, you can still get it. In terms of paramilitary organizations, yes, we have seen an increase around the Northern Ireland Protocol, using it as a foothold because they can use that as a way of trying to get more young people involved. We know that loyalist paramilitaries are active and recruiting and using that as a way of doing so. That kind of feeds into all the other issues that are contributing to that. The fact that why do we still have paramilitary organizations 25 years later? And what's happening to get rid of them? The short answer to that is nothing. Go ahead.
Hi, Dawn Miranda from the Northern Ireland area. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the All Ireland Women's Forum and your kind of your mission and your plans for that.
Great, I'll talk about the All Ireland Women's Forum, but not to worry, I'm going to come around about these. I'll get all your questions. I love the questions. Okay, so the All Ireland Women's Forum. The All Ireland Women's Forum was a structure I created when I was working with the National Women's Council. And that was when I was working in Dublin, right? So I was a Northerner coming now and working across the border. I was a cross-border worker. And what I could actually see was that since 1998, there had been a disconnect north and south. There had almost in some ways been this idea within the Republic that, well, the Good Friday Agreement happened, it's all grand, they can all take care of it, now we don't have to worry about it, right? But of course, peace and reconciliation and advancing the peace process is actually an all-island affair. And the issues in terms of what women are experiencing, the barriers that women have, they're the same north and south, regardless of it being two different legal jurisdictions. So it became pretty clear that there was an appetite to get women into a space to start talking about issues around gender equality, around women's role in peace building, and how we can try to advance that. Started in 2021, brings together 28 women, 14 from Northern Ireland, 14 from the Republic. And we worked across the first year on trying to create our first set of recommendations. So we brought in experts, we interrogated the politicians, a lot of fun. What we would do is we would bring in, say, for example, the Justice Minister from Northern Ireland, Justice Minister from the Republic, and we would look at what the gaps were in legislation and how we could try and find synergy. Because part of the Good Friday Agreement is actually a north-south equivalence of rights. And back in 1998, I would say the Republic was kind of on the other end of that, and now it's flipped. So Northern Ireland has become quite regressive with rights. We delivered a report last year with recommendations around trying to increase women's visibility in peace building spaces, trying to get gender quotas into political systems, because we can see in the Republic, the gender quota system worked, not necessarily as best as it could, but has worked a little bit in terms of within the parliamentary system there. We know from Norway it's very effective, but in Northern Ireland, we don't have gender quotas. So we're trying to get that kind of legislation moving, and also trying to get an all-island commitment to tackle gender-based violence. This second year, we've now been working on trying to advance those. So we're holding a residential in November, looking at how to create an all-island gender-based violence strategy. So we can't get the politicians to do it, but we're going to give it our best shot to do it ourselves. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marina from School of International Service. And my question was, you mentioned how there was about like 62% of the youth in Northern Ireland said that they felt their voice was being heard. Is there anything that's being done by either them or the government of Northern Ireland to kind of foster more inclusion and foster their voices and make them feel like they're being heard? Because I know that's also kind of an issue that's in the United States right now as well.
Thank you. And yourself?
I was just wondering, is there anything we can do to prevent the whataboutism that we always have when it comes to looking back at the past? As someone who grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, I remember it very well. It's interesting to me that the extreme parties are now have whitewashed their history so much to the young people that they're seen as very palatable. When if they look at their history, you mentioned about education, the Troubles and so on, it's not surprising to me, but shocking that people don't know that. So they find it very palatable. They should maybe look into that. And when I was growing up, the main parties are now so ineffectual because they're so small in terms of representation. I just wondered, do we have to wait for a generation of bigots to die? And hope that the new youthful people don't have as many bigots coming up in the same ratio. That's maybe unfair, but if you know what I'm saying.
Yes, I do know what you're saying. Okay, I'm going to take both these questions because they're nicely connected. I think the challenge that we have in Northern Ireland is the system in terms of political structure, actually, in my view, locks in sectarianism. I think it made sense in 1998. You know, if you look at the Alliance Party, you know, back then they only had a couple of MLAs. Alliance Party has like 18 now. And if you designate as other as the category in our political institutions, you actually don't have a vote when it comes to cross-community voting. And we now have a significant portion of democratically elected politicians who get excluded from cross-community voting. So that's quite an obvious example of how the political structures that were created in 1998 are actually working against democratic principles in 2023. And it also has locked in sectarianism because, and we see that not just from Northern Ireland, look at Lebanon as well as another example. We can see that actually this kind of mandatory power sharing structures can lock in sectarianism and identity politics and work against trying to advance progressive issues. And that's fed into the wider societal issues as well, you know, like because everything is just so focused on the DUP and Sinn Féin. And there's no room for anything else. And the smaller parties have lost ground because of that structure. I think if you were to remove the designations from Northern Ireland's political system, it would open up the electorate's views on who they could vote for, because, I mean, we vote for who we don't want to get in. That's how we vote. But if we remove this whole first minister, deputy first minister, largest nationalist party, largest unionist party, I think people might vote a little bit differently.
But they wouldn't have a themons and a nothings.
I hope we survive. I know. Just think about all the other issues we could talk about that wouldn't just be that.
Yes.
But that whataboutism, that is decades away from being removed from Northern Irish society. It's our bread and butter. It's part of the culture. I don't know. Next generation doesn't have it as much. If you look at the Northern Ireland Youth Forum research, it also shows 98% of respondents are comfortable with their identity and comfortable with the identity of others. So yeah, I think, you know, once they come of age, if we can get them to stay, because a lot of them leave, but if we can get them to stay, we might be able to move forward from that. Just to come to the question around spaces for young people, government policies, there is a Northern Ireland Youth Assembly, which is actually quite effective. It only has like 90 spaces, but the last time it was open, it had like 1,200 applicants, and that's people that are like 12 to 15. So I think that's pretty great. Northern Ireland Youth Forum, Youth Action NI, Cormila, these are the three organizations that are really doing a lot of work around creating spaces for young people. And then there's also the newly created All Ireland Youth Forum that was actually created by the Irish government in response to this appetite that young people have for having a kind of say. So they just launched it a couple of weeks ago. We'll see how they do. I was in there giving them advice to make sure they had teeth, you know, don't make it a talking shop, and make sure they give the politicians a hard time. So there are some initiatives that are happening. Anyone else? I'll take this one and this one. So go ahead.
Hi, my name is Rosie Chavez Martinez, and I'm with the School of National Service. In regards to paramilitary groups and femicides, is there any data or studies that show if these groups are a factor to violence on women and femicides?
Yeah, from yourself. Yeah. You.
Sorry, my question's actually very connected. I'm Abigail, also School of International Studies. I am curious when it comes to paramilitary recruiting, you touched on it a little bit, but if you know roughly statistics on like recruiting women versus men, the representation there, and then also if recruiting tactics differ between male and female young people.
Yeah, it's great and connected. So to come to the first question around the paramilitary groups and femicide levels, there is new research that was done by the Northern Ireland Women's Policy Group that looks at coercion. That's a big part. It's a noted and confirmed tactic used by paramilitaries in terms of coercive control in Northern Ireland. There's also a lot of evidence showing that they're essentially loan sharking, and because women are disproportionately impacted by poverty, that they are then falling into a situation where paramilitaries are going into that space where they're getting money from them and then controlling them and getting themselves into a very dangerous situation. So there is recent research on this. There isn't a lot of data on the connection between femicide and paramilitary organizations, but Northern Ireland Women's Policy Group is leading the way and trying to build some more research and data around that. There's also a report I would point you to around paramilitary influence and gender violence by Cooperation Ireland. On the question around recruitment, the most active recruitment is actually by loyalist paramilitary organizations. The Independent Reporting Commission looked at recently at data and showed about 12,500 card carrying members of loyalist paramilitaries in Northern Ireland. They are predominantly male. I don't have the exact figures on the sort of woman to male counter, but I do know that it is most often young teenagers who are growing up in an environment where they're socially and economically deprived, and then they are recruited. It's history is all the time, and it's still happening. Do you need a second? Just here, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I guess my question is, like you mentioned that the youth in Northern Ireland are at higher rates, like identifying as neither unionist nor nationalist. And I guess my question is, is that like when it comes to like where they see like the political status of Northern Ireland, is it that that's not as important of an issue as things like climate change and mental health, or are there like still divisions on that they just don't associate with the identity specifically?
Question. And go ahead.
So, my question also had to do with the, what they're interested in. And it had to do with two issues. How were those questions asked, that survey? Were they given a list of issues and then said these are important, or were they said open-ended? What do you care about? Because I was curious just on why jobs, housing was not mentioned as something people care about. Normally, those rise that if you have a low on, people are in poverty, mental health is usually the first thing. They want a job, or they're worried about violence, or they're worried about paramilitary. So that didn't come up. That surprised me. And second of all, the fact that there's 98% of women are feeling violence, that wasn't mentioned in the survey. So why isn't it? And so I'm just wondering how the survey was, was it a list of issues, or how was it done? And if I were trying to get the politicians to pay attention, I would certainly try to do a survey that puts women's violence, gets at the top of it. I would not have mental health at the top. I would have women's violence. So you have a specific issue and can say, this is what people care about.
Yeah, to come to that point around the issues that matter to young people and the surveys, they're two different surveys. Northern Ireland Youth Forum survey was on the slide, and that was looking at things like mental health, legacy, Brexit, human rights, and they were given a list. So on that list,
whoever developed that list.
Yes, that was for young people. The stats around the.
So I would think you want to talk to those people and say, why not include other things? I just curious.
Well, that's one piece of research. The other piece of research was actually done by Women's Resource and Development Agency. Not surprising that they did research around violence against women. And there was a third piece of research actually here as well. The 98% of women who've experienced one form of violence actually comes from the Ulster University, which did research on this that was just released last week. So that doesn't apply just to young people. That's actually a survey that was done with women. So a couple of different surveys in there just to confuse you, keep you on your toes. But yeah, they're all connected. But in terms of the issues that are priorities for young people, we see consistently that it is mental health, human rights, education. Education is a really big topic because a lot of young people are really quite frustrated that they're still being forced into a segregated education system where you're being boxed in to go into a school because your family happens to be Catholic or because they happen to be Protestant. That is a big issue for young people, and they really want to see integrated education so they don't have to get separated. I mean, the fact that our children are still being separated at the age of 5, and some are growing up and not meeting someone from another community until they're 18. Like, it shouldn't be like that at this point of the peace process. On the stuff around identity and the constitutional question, it is interesting because if you look at some of the surveys that have been done, we actually see that young people would consistently vote for United Ireland tomorrow, despite the fact that the majority don't identify as unionist or nationalist. And I think that points to the connection here between those surveys, because what young people are seeing is a Republic of Ireland that has more progression in terms of human rights, in terms of equality, in terms of the European Union. They all think that looks great. What they see in Northern Ireland is segregation, division, a system that isn't working for them, it isn't delivering for them. A lot of young people are still leaving to go to university because there's a lack of places, there's a lack of opportunities. And so for young people, I think shifting away from unionist and nationalist ideologies, it's also really kind of bucking against that kind of sectarianism. I mean, from my own personal experience, I never grew up with those terms myself within my own family environment. And it wasn't until a court case and I was pushed into the public eye that I suddenly was labeled nationalist by the newsletter, which is a predominantly loyalist publication. And it became very clear to me that those terms are actually used as dog whistles. They're used to segregate and divide people. And I think a lot of young people see that for what it is, and they're like, why do I have to be English or nationalist? Why can't I be a feminist or an internationalist or a social democrat? So I think that that's what it's rooted in. Go ahead. I'll take this one here, and I'm gonna move over to the side of the room. Go ahead.
I know you've written a bit about voter apathy, and I was wondering if you could just talk on not only some of the causes, but some of the possible solutions beyond, you know, waiting for this more politically active generation to sort of come of age.
Okay, I'm moving on to the other side of the room. Go ahead again.
You talked about the generation gap politically between older people and younger people. There's also a gap on attitudes towards organized religion. Can you talk about how that dynamic among young people is impacting this situation in Northern Ireland? And also, what has been the role of both churches on either side to either contributing or delaying reconciliation?
Okay, great. When I come to the question around voter apathy first, how do we tackle voter apathy? Well, the first solution, I think, would be, as I say, shifting the way that the political system is set up. I think if we pulled away those designations and we just, you know, if you think of mandatory power sharing as kind of like ugly scaffolding that was just to sort of stabilize governance and like needs to be pulled away now, that's how I would see it. I think if you do that, it will change how people vote. I think outside of that, an idea that I floated in some of my articles, which I know is never going to happen, but I still really like the idea of it, is the idea of mandatory voting. It works in countries like Belgium, it's not a panacea, but we need to find some kind of way to get people to engage with the political system. And I think that there's a strong argument for post-conflict societies having this kind of structure to get people to re-engage with the political system, and then hopefully it will stabilize and normalize from there. Generation gap and religion. We know that young people that are growing up today don't necessarily see themselves by religious affiliations. That's not just in Northern Ireland, but globally we do see a shift in that kind of association. I know in the Republic of Ireland, there's been a shift as well in terms of moving away from the Catholic Church, for example. But how the churches have played a role, churches have been a bit quiet. I mean, it's kind of part of the wider sort of silencing of civic voice as well, where they were quite active in the run up to the Good Friday Agreement and then kind of have been in the background. Only recently have the churches started to step out a little bit more to be more vocal around it. So much of the work does happen behind the scenes, but a challenge we face, I think, is how integrated our education system is with religion. And that, I think, creates a significant problem in perpetuating division. And we know, for example, that the Catholic Church in Northern Ireland still wants to keep the situation as it is in terms of integrated education. So that's a big challenge we face. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I'm Brindley from the School of International Service. And on the topic of integrated education, I was wondering, what do you see having the biggest impact or influence on the mindset towards integrated education when we see most of the activism coming from youth, but the people making those decisions are the parents and older generations? So what do you see actually making that change happen?
Okay, so how do we get integrated education to move quicker, and how do I see that change happening? You know, it's funny, it's actually politicians that block the advancing of integrated education. The way that the system is set up at the moment, parents actually have to be the ones that push forward. They have to go through an entire process where their school has to go through a balloting and they have to go through a voting system, and they have to campaign to be able to get that status. The political system underfunds integrated education, whether it was the DUP had the education brief or when Sinn Féin had the education brief, equally both of them underfunded integrated education and didn't give the resources necessary to advance it. Groups like the Integrated Education Fund do a lot of work in this area. But when I was talking earlier about how the education was 93% segregated, like it was actually only 3% that's increased since 1998 because it was already 4% in 1998. So we've made a 3% increase in 25 years. Like that is pretty shocking lack of progress. So what we actually need is we need our political system to be up and running. There is a new integrated education bill that was put forward by the Alliance parties, Kelly Armstrong last year. that creates an onus on the political system to resource and advance integrated education. But in order for that to happen, they have to go back into Stormont first. Anybody else? The back.
Hi, I'm Helena from the School of Public Affairs. I'm curious about integrated education also, and sort of the way that that would like practically work itself out if the schools became completely integrated. How do you think people would sort of sort themselves into those schools? Like, do you think that there would be a sort of natural sorting of like Protestant and Catholic again, even if people had the choices to go to schools that were fully integrated? And if that was so, how would we sort of like prevent that social sorting through a political way?
Okay, so keeping on the theme of integrated education, one of the other challenges we have around progressing this is a lack of information on what integrated education actually is and what it means. And there's a concern within some religious groupings that it might strip away their religious upbringing, or, I mean, take, for example, where I live in County Fermanagh, the closest village to me is 5 Mile Town, and the Catholic primary school is at risk of closure in 5 Mile Town because they don't have enough pupils. Now, there's conversations happening about integrating the Catholic school with the state school and creating integrated status for these two schools. Therefore, they would be put into the one space. The parents for the Catholic school are concerned and nervous that that means their children are not going to have any kind of education in religious doctrine. So the challenge we have also is having enough information available to parents to ensure that those that do have concerns over what integrated education actually means, that they can see that that actually is about having a process of reconciliation between young people and doesn't diminish your religion if that's what you choose for your children. So I think that's one of the big challenges that we actually have, is also an awareness campaign of what integrated education really is. Do I think that people would continue to be segregated even if we integrated all the schools? No, I think people will go to the closest school because who wants to travel far? Yeah.
So one issue that seems to have united every political faction in the North is the Legacy and Reconciliation Bill. Do you see a difference age-wise, demographically, between, you know, older folks who either lived through or, you know, I'll just say lived through the troubles, as opposed to the younger generation who is more well, the impacts are certainly there, did not physically live through it. Is there any I know it's early, but any early discernment on how it's received by both of these groups?
Yeah, so just going to the question on, is there a generational gap in responding to the legacy bill? I would say yes. Actually, there is already evidence that perhaps young people are not as engaged around the legacy bill, because for a lot of youth groups and young people, it really is the issues around mental health, around education, around the things that are really impacting their lives. And there is a disassociation for the next generation from the conflict. Now, that's not going to be across the board, because lots of young people suffer from intergenerational trauma. Lots of families are still impacted by the conflict, and lots of young people are having to go through that trauma within their own homes. But I think in terms of the youth activist groups, we haven't seen the same kind of response that we've seen from, for example, the victims groups. But it is worth noting that there is resounding rejection across the board in Northern Ireland for the legacy bill. It is not going to be compliant with the ECHR. It is already being challenged with 15 cases already lodged against it. And the legacy bill really is a piece of legislation that the damage is already done. I mean, we know that Labour have said that if they get into power next year, that they will undo the legacy bill. But the damage in terms of trust with victims and survivors, that can't be undone. Yes. Yeah.
Can you expand on the street art that you have listed on there, and if it's connected to or has somehow evolved from the East Wall murals, and if it's connected to tourism?
Yeah, and I'll take one more question. Okay.
So, when you with the social media and I guess Barb and stuff, and like podcasters like Andrew Tate, there's a rise in violence and hostility against women. I was wondering if we saw the impacts of people like Andrew Tate on men specifically in Northern Ireland and the impact of violence against women, and anything like that has been used in the recruitment for paramilitary groups.
And third, maybe?
So I recently had a professor tell me that formulating a peace, like a peaceful future between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland will not happen, and that's not worth researching. So I was just wondering
Not an AU professor.
I was just wondering what you had to say about a peaceful future between the two, and like how you see that happening, because it, according to her, will not.
Okay, I'll take the question about Andrew Tate and social media first. I point you towards Women's Resource and Development Agency. They do a lot of work in terms of violence against women, and have a lot of research on various areas. Now, I'm not aware if there's a direct correlation, but we know that people like Andrew Tate and this kind of misogyny on social media is having a significant impact on increases of violence against women and girls. I think it also has a significant increase in women in public life, because why would you want to go into politics? Why would you want to go into peace building? Why would you want to be a civic activist when you're going to face an onslaught of abuse on social media? It does have a silencing effect on women. And there's a need to look at how do you address that beyond just legislation, because legislation doesn't necessarily always protect from those kind of environments. And obviously Twitter has gone to hell, so it's not going to get any better. In terms of street art, yeah, the street art I think is a really good example of how Northern Ireland has progressed. There are street art tours now, so you can go and do like a whole tour in Belfast of all the various street art areas. And what I find great about it is that the art we see now, you know, it used to be rooted in the past, but now it's about mental health or human rights or feminism, or just because it's kind of cool. So we have now a really vibrant street art scene. It's been globally recognized, and there's been awards won for our street artists. And I think what we see there are young people using art as a way to kind of build reconciliation. It's an under-recognized form of peace building, that art and culture is a way that people can build reconciliation between each other. So yeah, you should check it out. There's some great street art tours and some great pieces of research on it as well. Peaceful future, I'd love to know who that professor was. Of course, a peaceful future can and will be created between Northern Ireland and the Republic. I'm of the belief that there will be a referendum. It is within the Good Friday Agreement. It is what people voted for in 1998. And I think that the work that needs to be done in advance of a vote is that there needs to be work done to create better understanding north and south. Often you'll hear stereotypes, perhaps in the Republic, about what Northern Ireland is today, that it's a divided community. But people in politics are not the same thing. Politics in Northern Ireland is very divided, but people in Northern Ireland are not divided. And I actually think, from my experience as a cross-border worker and as someone who has, you know, who writes primarily for a Southern audience, that the biggest disconnect in Ireland is north and south. That there needs to be a lot more cross-border cooperation to build understanding. I know there has been some calls for an all-Ireland citizens assembly, but I'm not a fan of this model. I think the citizens assembly model, where you bring in 100 citizens to deliberate over a particular issue, is excellent for things that could be quite contentious, like changing national symbols, which will surprisingly be quite difficult, I think, to address. But in terms of how you build understanding, in terms of how you get people to recognize that if we're going to have a referendum on a new or United Ireland, that will require significant changes to the current Irish state. You need to create an environment for people to have those conversations. So I favor a national dialogue model, which has been used in other countries. If you look at Colombia, for example, they have done significant work on having national dialogues. And if you use that model, it's kind of getting into communities, getting people to really have difficult conversations. And I think it just has much more impact beyond having 100 citizens in the Citizens Assembly. And plus the Citizens Assembly model, you know, it's never going to be able to cover how many topics that there really are to be addressed here. It requires government research, university research, requires the national dialogue structure. You put all those things in place, of course, it's going to be a peaceful resolution. And I think you should do that research. I'd love to see it. And where are we? Should we try for anyone else or are we going to close up?
Yeah.
Who wants the last question?
Oh, I see one. I was wondering about the pandemic and if that sort of brought people together and what the government response was, if there was more civic action in responding to the pandemic, or if that was from the government, and then if that sort of brought people together on both sides, sort of one enemy.
Yeah, I mean, look, COVID-19 did bring a lot of communities together. We were all impacted by the same challenges. I'd like to say that it made our politics better, but we have within the political system in Northern Ireland something called the Petition of Concern or the St. Andrews vote. Basically, it's a structure where a political party can veto something that they don't like. It was originally designed to be a human rights protection where you were able to safeguard minority rights. Since the Good Friday Agreement with the St. Andrews changes, it's been distorted and used to block progress. And during the pandemic, the DUP actually used the St. Andrews veto to block COVID-19 regulations. So I'd like to say it brought our politicians closer together, but no, it didn't. Community groups worked very hard. People on the ground worked very hard in terms of trying to help people. But as is usually the case, politics and people in Northern Ireland are two very different things.
So again, I would like to thank all the sponsors who made possible today's event. I would also like to say thank you to you all, because if you don't have an audience, you can have a talk, but it doesn't go anywhere. So we're grateful to all of you for being here. I want to make mention that the event was live streamed. There will also be a recording posted on the SPA social media. And lastly, to give a huge thank you to Emma DeSouza for bringing us her wisdom and explaining